Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wassalatu wassalamu ala sayyidil mursaleen wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in amma ba'd. So does everybody have to be so far away? I mean, distancing is okay, but it's not really okay, but anyway, if you have to. But let's be as close as possible, with the feeling that we're actually together. Okay, Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wassalatu wassalamu ala sayyidil mursaleen wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in amma ba'd. So we've reached the halaqah, the 14th halaqah. Allahu Akbar. But it's not moving. What?
Yeah.
The projector screen is an extension of this page.
So,
Little technical thing here, as usual.
so if you scroll all the way to the right, so if you scroll the mouse all the way to the right, it'll eventually wind up on here, and you can click it there.
Sorry.
Sorry.
How did you do that?
Just click the mouse
Oh.
when it's on this screen.
Last week we didn't have the Facebook streaming.
Huh?
Last week we didn't have the Facebook streaming.
Yeah, actually, last week, Subhanallah la yansa. Insan, it comes from nisyan. Nisyan means forgetfulness. So actually, what happened was, and we'll extend that apology to anybody that's online also. What happened is that everything was set up, but we didn't push stream. So obviously, it doesn't think for itself. It's supposed to be intelligent, but it's not that intelligent. And even we who run it are not all that intelligent as we think we are. And so it didn't get streamed. Sorry about that. So inshallah. Maybe we can upload, maybe we can do that and upload it another time, inshallah. Okay. So now we're going to look at Sayyidina Rasul alayhi salatu wasalam in his early manhood. So we talked about the Harb al-Fijar and the Half al-Fudul, and now we're going to look at the events which ultimately culminate with the most auspicious joining of two human beings, Sayyidina Rasulullah wa Sayyidah Khadija radhiyallahu anha. And so Nabi alayhi salatu wasalam, as we learned earlier, that Quraysh, they were basically they were people who, they were traders, they were tujar. That was their. And as we read in the surah Quraysh, you know. So in Surah Quraysh, so Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, his special, sort of system that he developed for them is that they had those caravans in the summer and in the winter. In the summer, they would go to Syria, and in the winter, they would go to Yemen. And so that was basically the means of livelihood for Ahl Makkah. They had no agriculture, they had nothing else. So basically, that's what they were involved in. That was their, as they say, asbab al-ma'isha, their means of livelihood. So being from that, in that environment, and also being from the lineage of his forefathers, were also involved in the very same type of activity. So he, began working in the caravans, and he would go to the caravans, and we mentioned also that he went with his uncle, and also the event of Bahira. And so therefore his uncle was quite, hesitant, not quite, he was very hesitant that to let his nephew travel towards Syria, because the Bahira also told him to look out, because particularly from the Jews, if they come to know, about him, then there'll be a problem. So in any case, but he engaged in the caravans, and he was also engaging in business, and he engaged in the various markets around Makkah. And being that he was destined to be the guide for all humanity, so obviously Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, from his very inception, he was of the most immaculate character, honesty, integrity, and as we probably mentioned several times, he was known as as-Sadiq al-Amin, the truthful and the trustworthy. Sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. and his most magnificent character. So he became well known for that, actually. And even though the family, they were quite poor, and it was a difficult time, as we're going to see inshallah soon. And also, interestingly, he mentions about a partnership that he had, and actually, so if you had, it's just like today, similar, that if you have capital, then you work with your capital. If you don't have capital, what do? You work as an agent. So Rasulullah worked as an agent working with the other people's capital, other people's, merchandise. And so there was another fellow who was also working in the same capacity, Asad ibn Abi Sa'ib. And they had a partnership, and Nabi Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam thereafter praised him for his integrity and honesty. And ultimately, later down the line, quite later down the line, at the time of Fath Makkah, so he had actually not, his former partner had not accepted Islam until then. However, at Fath Makkah, so his former partner actually came and presented himself, and so Rasulullah mentioned him, and he welcomed him, saying, "Welcome, my brother and partner, both honest and straightforward." And he further said to him, "You had been performing actions in Jahiliyyah that carry no weight, because you weren't a Muslim. Whatever good you did, you got your recompense in the world. However, he used to grant loans to people, and he used to help them out. He was kind to his relatives, he used to, give them charity, etc. However, just like Abdullah ibn Jud'an, if you remember, we mentioned about him, that he did all these good works, but it was not for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So whatever they got in the world, that's it, nothing in the hereafter." So therefore, Nabi said, so you had been doing these amal salih, these good actions in Jahiliyyah that have no weight, because you didn't have Tawheed. Now that you've accepted Islam, now they carry weight. So in other words, carry on. MashaAllah. Okay, it was a difficult time in Makkah at this particular time, in this particular juncture. There was drought, plus Abu Talib, he, even with all that nobility, but in terms of wealth, he didn't have the wherewithal, and there was quite abject poverty that they were subjected to, he and his entire family, and among others in Makkah. So the opportunity to work with the Sayyidah Khadija radiallahu ta'ala. Now, Sayyidah Khadija, we're going to talk a little bit about her later on. Now, so in this particular juncture, so it came to light that Khadija radiallahu ta'ala anha, who was the most noble and the wealthiest woman of Makkah, and she was a businesswoman, and she would send her caravan. Now, this is also interesting to understand. On the one hand, we have the Arabs, they're burying their women children, On the other hand, we have people like Sayyidah Khadija radiallahu ta'ala, who was, probably the feminists would have loved her, because she was quite independent, and she was quite, and she would actually hire men, right? And however, she just see the difference of of times. Even though she was a wealthy, she would get down there in the middle of it, and keeping her nobility and her standard of sharaf, and integrity, she would remain aloof from the men, and the men would work in her, in her wealth, and she would, remain in the confines of, in the sanctity of her own home, and without, delving into the world of the men, which was considered, quite, quite as we say, an aib. It was really low class. Of course, these days now, we've lost the sense of gender, feminines. Women are trying to be like men, and men are trying to be like women. We've sort of lost our identities. So this was even in Jahiliyyah. In any case, so she would, hire men to work with her wealth and work with her merchandise. And so it came to light that she's going to send a caravan to Syria. And so Abu Talib, sort of hinted that, why don't you try and, take this opportunity. Khadija wants somebody, and perhaps you could get that position, And at the same time, as we mentioned, but the caravan was going to Syria, so he was hesitant, perhaps, In any case, it came to light that, that Rasulullah actually wanted that position, and The books have mentioned different things. Either he approached it or he was approached. In any case, he got the job and he went. So Rasulullah is hired, and obviously we said since Rasulullah was so well known, obviously Khadija would have known very well, and she was also a distant relative. So, and not so distant relative, actually, as a matter of fact. But they were, so obviously everybody knew everybody, and so she was well aware of Rasulullah's sterling qualities, so obviously she took the opportunity and hired him. And she also had a servant whose name was Maysara. And so Maysara went along on the journey, and he's the one that's going to narrate later on all of these amazing incidents that take place. So on the way, when they get to Syria, there was a place called, they call it Bosra, some of them mentioned below. In any case, somewhere in Syria, in that area, Bilad Sham, again, there's another, incidents with, the monks. So there was a Christian monk that some of the books mention, his name was Nestor. So Rasulullah, they get down and rest near his monastery, and he's observing, these people are coming in, so he's observing. And so Rasulullah is actually resting under a particular tree. So now Maysara, he comes and says, asks, this Nestor, the monk, he comes and he asks, Maysara, who is this? So Maysara replies, this is a man from Quraysh, from Ahl al-Haram. So Maysara replies that nobody except a Nabi sleeps under this tree. Nobody except a Nabi. Now, what does that mean? Number one, the riwayat, again, we were talking about historical riwayats and how accurate they are, we don't know. But in any case, this is mentioned in the books. Right? So how did he know, or how could only Nabis be under this tree? A tree, the last Nabi was Sayyidina Isa alayhi salam, right? Which was, approximately 500 years previously. In any case, perhaps it was known to him by the scriptures or whatever that the prophet to come would actually get down and rest under this tree. In any case, so he mentioned, to Maysara about this, and that this fellow is destined to be a prophet. Okay, and it also mentions some of the ulama mentioned that perhaps, this is actually, he understood this from the prophecy that is mentioned in the book of Genesis, even in the present day Bible. It says, and Jacob called unto his sons and said, gather yourselves together that I may tell you that which will befall you in the last days. And Nabi Alayhi Salam says, I and the day of judgment are just about this close. So looking at the entire history of humanity and the advent of Rasulullah until the end of judgment, it was very close. In any case, indicating in the last chapter, last era of humanity. So the scepter shall not depart from Judah. In other words, authority and nubuwwat will not depart from Judah, which are the sons of Bani Israel, right? Israel. So, nor a lawgiver from beneath his feet until Shiloh comes. Shiloh. So who is Shiloh? And unto him shall the gathering of the people be. So what does this indicate? So, wallahu alam, number one, whatever is related in the Bible, we don't know its authenticity in any case. But the point is that this points to the scepter will depart from Judah, meaning, if this has any veracity, so it means that the nubuwwat will shift from Bani Israel to another nation. And so obviously, that couldn't be Isa alayhi salam because he was from Bani Israel himself. So it had to be speaking about who? Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Right? So perhaps, these monks, and as we said, these former priests and monks and Herakl himself, they had quite a lot of information pointing to the last prophet to come. In any case, so this was one of the things that took place. Also, so Maysara is watching this whole scenario. He's watching this. He hears from this monk. He's watching Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam in his dealings and his transactions, the barakat. just as we've seen everywhere Rasulullah is, the barakah flows, right? So amazing business was done there in Syria, and then bringing the goods from Syria. Then what they used to do is they would take the goods from Mecca, they would sell it in Syria, then they'd take the goods from Syria and they would bring them to Mecca. And so there was a double way, it was a double, sort of two-way, sort of caravan. So profit was made there, immense profit was there, and it's mentioned that, probably double, if not more, profit was actually, as was realized. So on the one hand, this very amazing, incidents, and on the second, the amazing amount of barakat in that business and how much they actually earned, right? Also, Maister says that he saw, while Rasulullah was in the midday sun, that two angels were actually coming and, shadowing him. In any case, when he gets back, so he tells Khadija radiallahu anha about all these things. And so Khadija radiallahu anha is, and she's, you could say the number one woman of Quraysh at that point. So Khadija bint, let's talk a little bit about Khadija. Khadija bint Khuwaylid ibn Asad from Bani Asad. So that was, and also we talked a little earlier that Bani Asad and Quraysh, from the very beginning, they had their connections, from on, and this is going to also play in the future. So she was the most noble, from the most noble lineage of Quraysh. So she was the most noble woman in terms of her lineage, and the most noble and wealthy woman, and in terms of her character and qualities, and in terms of even, physical wealth, she was the most wealthiest woman in Makkah. And obviously, that being the case, you can imagine every nobleman of Quraysh wants her hand. But it didn't happen, and she didn't accept. And she used to actually, she would employ the men by the means of mudaraba. In other words, with her wealth, she would employ these men, and they would actually do the transacting, and they would do the work, and then they would get a commission or whatever the arrangement would be. Okay, she was also, not only that, she was also extremely intelligent and very shrewd and wise and discerning, along with that nobility. And apart from that which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala actually intended for her, that she's going to be the most auspicious woman, to walk on the planet, having married, the most auspicious man who walked on the planet, right? So all of that, is majma of the conglomerate of fadail and virtues of Sayyidah Khadija radiallahu anha. And it's very interesting that Nabi sallallahu never stopped mentioning her and praising her. And to the extent that Aisha radiallahu anha, she said, why do you keep mentioning this old woman from Quraysh? And Allah has given you this, new, young, fresh, and who's actually better. She meant better in the sense of, young and beautiful. And so Nabi Sallallahu said straight up, La, he has not given me somebody better. In other words, she is top of the line, she'll always be top of the line. And so Aisha radiallahu anha, she says, I never had ghairat or jealousy for anyone like I had for Khadija, and she wasn't even alive, radiallahu ta'ala anha. And we're going to see later on, at the very beginning of Nubuwwat, the support that she gave to Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had prepared her, just as he had prepared Rasulullah, he had prepared Sayyidah Khadija radiallahu ta'ala anha for this mission, Allahu Akbar. So obviously, when she heard this account, and Maysar has mentioned all of these miraculous things, and the character of Rasulullah, just affirming what was already known about him, and then even more. So, she said, "This is the man that I want." Right? So, all of these other nobles of Quraysh couldn't, weren't up to the par. So now her match has been met. So she is actually the one who initiated the proposal. Okay? So Khadija narrates this story of the monk to her cousin Waraqah, and we're going to see Waraqah ibn Nawfal, as we mentioned earlier, perhaps that he had, studied, the books of Christianity and Judaism, and he actually probably knew Aramaic and Hebrew, and he had studied, the former books. So he also collaborated. This is something. And also, she consulted with her friend Nufaysa, and actually Nufaysa is the one who actually came and approached Rasulullah from the side of Khadija. So this is another, the feminists probably would like this, yeah? So actually the woman actually, she, went ahead and made that proposal, and this is perfectly, this is perfectly acceptable in Islam as well. Okay, so thereafter, once the ice is broken, the ground is sort of prepared, then Khadija radiallahu anha, she herself, submits the proposal. And she says something more or less like this, that, "O son of my uncle, I love you for our kinship, your trustworthiness, your beautiful character and speech." And she also mentioned about the fact that he was a person of neutrality between the tribes, and he wouldn't take sides, and he wouldn't, come to somebody's assistance simply because of the blood ties. He was always on the side of justice. And she also mentioned that as well. So Bani Hashim and Asad also had pre-existing ties. So this was also another strategic, move that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala planned. And being that Bani Hashim and Bani Asad also had strategic ties previously, and they had, the most recent one being the marriage of Safiya radiallahu anha, the aunt of Rasulullah, Hamza's sister, who, as we mentioned earlier, Hamza and Safiya were both, very similar to the age of Rasulullah, okay, even though they were uncle and aunt. And so Safiya had married Khadija's brother Awam, and so this makes it all the more, solidifies those ties. So naturally Hamza accompanies along with Abu Talib, his nephew to Khadija's uncle, to officially ask for her hand. Upon meeting of Khadija's uncle, Amr ibn Asad, so Abu Talib, he spoke, and obviously, the Arabs, it's very eloquent in Arabic, and they would just right on the spot just say the most eloquent things, beautiful of language. So he said, "This is the nephew of mine, Muhammad ibn Abdullah, without peer in his nobility of character and descent. If he is not wealthy, wealth is something that comes and goes." And he went on to talk about that. That's not important. The thing is the nobility of character and descent. "He will certainly have a great future. He is proposing marriage to your honorable daughter, Khadija." Now, that was his uncle. So daughter meaning that the uncle, the niece is like the daughter. Now, whether her father perhaps was not alive, or maybe the uncle was the chief of the tribe, whatever, I don't know exactly, but somehow or another, the uncle was the one who was actually sought in terms of the permission. Okay, so obviously Amr immediately accepts the marriage, and it was concluded with a dowry of 20 camels, which was a pretty hefty dowry, by the way. Okay. So Rasulullah remained with Khadija radiallahu anha for 25 years. And mind you, the most well-known riwayats concerning the age of Rasulullah, that he was 25 and that Khadija radiallahu anha was 40 of age. And some contest that, but that is what is well known, in the books of Sirah, wallahu a'lam. And for 25 years, Rasulullah remained with Khadija, and contrary to the custom, because the polygamy was very, was the order of the day, and it would be expected, particularly for somebody of that nobility, that they would have, multiple wives. But he remained with Khadija solely for 25 years up until her death, even though she was quite advanced in age as opposed to Rasulullah. So now another interesting thing about this marriage was that prior to the marriage, Rasulullah had inherited a servant, a slave actually, from his father, her name was Barakah. Okay, so Nabi Sallallahu on his wedding day, he emancipated Barakah and gave her freedom so that she could go, and she also married a man that she had somehow connected with from Yathrib. So reciprocating, Khadija radiallahu anha, she gifted the Rasul with her servant, who was Zayd ibn Haritha radiallahu ta'ala anha. And this is how Zayd came into the picture and became known as later on Zayd ibn Muhammad, right? So this was a wedding gift from Khadija radiallahu ta'ala anha, to Rasul alayhi salatu wasalam. So he was 15 years old, Sayyidina Zayd radiallahu anhu, he was 15 years old at that time, and he was actually an Arab. He was from an Arab from Bani Kalb, and between Syria and Iraq, from the northern area of the Jazeera. And what happens, as we mentioned earlier when we were talking about the tribes would, this tribe would, conquer that tribe and kill the men and take the women and the children and make them their slaves. And that was the order of the day. It was pretty much going on like that all over the world. But in any case, that was the tribal situation. And so he was actually abducted among these skirmishes or wars or whatever. And so he was ultimately sold into slavery there in Makkah. So after the marriage, Zayd radiallahu ta'ala anhu had met pilgrims that used to come from Makkah. They would come, people would be coming from all over the Jazeera. So people would come from his own tribe, and so he would meet with them. So he met with them and then told them, look, I'm fine, I'm very happy and comfortable here. And so that news reached back to his father and his family. So, whereupon his father, Harith ibn Shirahil, his father came to Makkah, that he's found, and he used to recite all this poetry. There's a lot of poetry that's mentioned in the books that he used to, compose, weeping and mourning, and crying for his son. And now he finds out where his son is, and so he comes, and he's prepared to pay any amount, but just release his son so that he can now, come out of slavery and go back to his family. Okay? So he comes, his father comes, and he meets Zayd, and he meets Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and so Rasul says, yes, okay, fine. He's your father, this is your father, he's your son. So if you like, you can go with him. So Zayd would get really, he really got, taken by that, and he started weeping, and he's saying, I can't leave Rasulullah, I can't leave Muhammad, Emphasizing, so he told, you're free to return if you want to go back. So Rasulullah said, yes, if you want, you can go. Zayd replied, I would not choose any man in preference to you. You are to me as my father and mother. I have seen, and then he's talking to his father. He says, I've seen from this man, Rasulullah, such things that I could never choose anyone above him. And so you can imagine the father, you're in slavery here as a slave in Makkah, and now you can come back with me as a free man to your own family and your father, and you want to stay here, So he explains it. You see, I have seen in this individual what you won't see anywhere, and obviously that was, words couldn't express actually what he was trying to say. So upon hearing this, so Rasulullah invited Zayd's father and his uncle, I guess the two of them were there together for that proposition. So he invited them to come to the Kaaba, where Rasulullah he made an announcement. He said, "O all who are present, bear witness that Zayd is my son, and is my son. I am his heir, and he is mine." So he took him as his actual son, and this continued until Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, negated, tabanni for Islam, the adoption. And so adoption in the sense of making someone your actual son or daughter, that's not going to happen, because your father and mother, who are your actual biological father, they cannot be substituted for anyone else. So this is not possible in Islam. But in any case, until that order came from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he was known actually as Zayd ibn Muhammad. And then we're going to see that throughout his life, that Nabi had such a love for Zayd. He used to ask, who do you love the most? He would mention Zayd. You can imagine this relationship that they had. So inshallah, I think that's heavy enough dose for today, quite a lot. Yeah. And then we have other important issues, the Bunyan and Kaaba coming up, and that's a very, very important story. Any questions? Anything came on from the social media? Nothing. Okay. Any questions from the...
Clarification I was wondering if you could give us. When you said that the caravan was going to Syria, which part are you talking about? Where was that location where you sat down? Because we know you mentioned that Syria is actually the whole entire Levant section area. So
Well, probably don't. They mention a place called Bostra, Wallahu alam. But where that place is, I don't. Maybe nobody really knows. Wallahu alam. Yeah.
Sheikh, is there any virtue in actually remembering all these places that our history that were important in our history?
Anything connected to Rasul Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam is important. Yeah. Now, just like in Quran, we mentioned about that in tafsir many times. The place and the name of the person, and these facts and figures, which history generally pays a lot of attention to. That's not the point. The point is, what's the takeaway? What learning is there? That's so the same is here. The idea is we're trying to, develop a connection and reverence, for Rasul, and seeing the amazing things that Allah Subhanahu wa Taala, prepared in ushering in His prophethood is also part of that. Is part of that process of reverence. It also highlights special position. Wallahu alam. So actually, the place and the day and the time and the name, and it's really not that. That's not a critical thing.
Also, one more thing. So, Khadija radiallahu anha, she knew that Prophet ﷺ is not a normal, like he's special.
I think probably most of the people knew that.
Really?
As we mentioned earlier on, Abu Talib was continuously saying, he very early on, Bahira, the whole waqi of Bahira, the monk who mentioned, they told him about all this. So Abu Talib knew very early on that this is a special person, and everyone who came in contact with him, of course, they knew that this is a special person. How special he was, that they probably had no clue, but that came to light later on. And we're going to see in the next episode in the Bunyan al-Kaaba, he was the one that settled that whole dispute. It was they were about ready to go to war right there on the, next to the Kaaba. And when they saw that Muhammad is going to decide, everybody was fine with that. هذا الأمين الذي امتنع حكمه. That's the one we can accept his. So everybody knew he was special. But how special, that was yet to be manifest. Wallahu a'lam. Yeah.
I was just a bit curious, how exactly did the caravans work? Like, where did they get the goods from? Did they essentially act on behalf of the people of Mecca when they went to Syria and then had to come back?
Yeah,
and
well,
redistribute some of those
Makkah didn't
products?
really have much of anything as far as I know. So everything was coming from basically Yemen or Syria. So it was kind of the Meccans were like the medium, bringing, this kind of like the honeybees, they don't have anything with them. They just pick the nectar here and then deposit it there. So they were taking things from Yemen, and then some of the things would come to Makkah, then maybe they took stuff, and maybe there were some products that were made, and maybe they had some kind of things that they crafts or something they made, I don't know. But most of whatever there was, because Arabia, what did they have? They didn't have anything, anything really there, Maybe some leather, perhaps, maybe leather goods, it's a possibility. But basically the trade was the goods of Yemen and the goods of Syria, because these were the two big, hubs of trade, and they also had lots of different types of products in these areas, and old civilizations and craftsmen of very high caliber. Wallahu a'lam. Okay, anything else? سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك نشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت نستغفرك ونتوب إليك والسلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.
Your mouse is over on the screen, so you should pull it all the way over to the left. Yeah, you'll get it back over. Further. It should be over here.
Oh yeah, okay.